speaker today is, what, his third trip here, I think, something like that, Roderick Russell. He's a professional sword swallower, a rock climber, a fear and anxiety coach. So if any of you have fears and anxieties, this is the guy that can take care of you. Well, you have... his work has been featured in many highlights, including the Discovery Channel, the Travel Channel, Ripley's Believe It or Not, and the Guinness Book of World Records, and you'll have to tell us which one that is. As well as he's done countless radio, TV, and newspaper interviews across the country. A native of New England, and I don't know what state you're talking about.
New Hampshire. Sorry to disappoint.
He's traveled the world in many capacities over the past 2 decades, coaching, guiding, speaking, and teaching his clients and audience how to perform their best while on the edge of their comfort zones. Would you please welcome back Roderick Russell.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you guys for coming out. First off, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, not too loud? Okay, perfect. Well, John gave me a fantastic introduction, so I can skip the first 20 slides. No, this is, as he says, about my third time back here with the OLLI program. I appreciate UVM and OLLI and John Newton for inviting me back time and time again. You guys are always a great audience to work with. Today's topic is rock climbing risk and psychological well-being. It looks like we have a nice formal presentation here. I do have a lot of slides, but it's not formal at all. It is totally informal. If you guys have any questions throughout the process, feel free to raise your hand or just shout it out, and we'll see if we can address it. As I say, I do have a lot of slides, so hopefully we can get through them all, but I'll just try to keep things moving. Do we have any climbers in the audience today? No? Okay, this is going to be fun. You guys have a completely fresh audience. As I say, rock climbing risk and psychological well-being. John already gave me a great introduction, but my name is Roderick Russell. I am a rock climbing guide, a professional sword swallower, and a mental fitness coach. I work with fear and anxiety in particular, but also specifically helping people perform well while at the edge of their comfort zone. That is, I teach people the evidence-based skills to approach and work in high stress, high anxiety, high pressure situations to work their best. My work has taken me all over the world, and it's by its very nature has garnered me a lot of attention from the major media. There's just a few examples of the places that have featured me. And a lot of what people think, and this is one of the big challenges that I face when I'm speaking to an audience or I'm training people with fear and anxiety or mental skills, is they look at what I do. They see the sword swallowing, they see all the rock climbing, and they think, oh, this guy must just be an adrenaline junkie. And sorry about that. Work with the slides here. Come on. Bear with me. I just put this together. This is the first time this is ever being seen. All right, so yes, they think he must just be an adrenaline junkie. Of course he doesn't have problems with fear. Of course he doesn't have problems with anxiety. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I've often said that if I'm doing what I do, any of the number of things that I do or have done throughout my life, if I'm feeling and experiencing adrenaline, I know that I've done something wrong. I actually don't like adrenaline at all. I'm not a thrill seeker, and I have my own problems with fear and anxiety, and that's how I ended up becoming a trainer in the topic. But I can understand why people think that I must be some sort of adrenaline junkie. It's not just the two things that we mentioned, the sword swallowing and the rock climbing, that drive me. All through my entire life, I've done a number of things that sort of push the edge and are sort of thrill-seeking in their style and nature. Going all the way back to when I was a young kid. This is a picture of me in the 80s. I am that little guy there in the blue and white. This is me on my first sponsored competitive skateboarding team back in the 80s. Just to be clear, that's before skateboarding was cool. Yeah. So, a little bit on the edge there as a little kid, pushing the edge. And I've done the whole gamut of your usual thrill-seeking types of things. Jumping out of planes. When I started doing things professionally on stage, I continued the thrill-seeking and sort of theme, the risk theme. This is me upside down in a straitjacket and about 80 feet of chains and 2 padlocks trying to wriggle myself free. This is a picture of me on stage, the tail end of that sort of thing, getting out of the straitjacket. So I did a bunch of escape art. I've had a long romance with fire. I've been a professional fire breather. This is I don't know if you can see that on the slide. It's a little dim in here, but this big fireball here is coming from, that's me there, and there's a second person. That's actually a double fireball right there. So a little romance with fire. I've also been a fire walking instructor. And I apologize for the quality of these slides. I really had to dig into my archives to find some of these photos, and they were really low resolution and low quality. So if there's any pixelation there, I do apologize. But this is me on a fire walk, of which I used to lead. And then my personal favorite is fire eating. This is a picture of me in Alaska, oh gosh, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, eating some fire. If you'd like to see what that fire eating looks like, a little fire manipulation of fire eating, we've got a little video here. Again, dredged up from the archives, not the highest quality, but it will give you a little peek of what it looks like. Lighting my hand on fire and transferring it to the second torch. Little tricks, I guess you could say, transferring the fire from one torch to the other. Lighting my hand on fire and lighting the second torch. And to be clear, there's nothing on my hands or in my mouth to make any of this possible. This is all just physics and working with pain. So that was the fire eating, obviously. This next piece, I've just paused it here for a second because I want to point out what's going to happen in this next little clip. You're going to see me place one of the burning torches into my mouth. I will suck off a packet of the burning vapors. I'll remove the torch still lit, but I'll keep the vapors burning inside my body as well. I'll take a second torch, which isn't yet lit. I'll hold it above my head, release the vapors, and light the second torch. Happens very fast. It's a very delicate maneuver, but you're about to see it, so keep your eyes peeled. And a little more fire eating. So that's a little example of what the fire eating and fire manipulation looks like. It's something that I've loved for many, many years. And then, of course, there's the things that I'm most famous for. That's sword swallowing. And if you're wondering if that's real, it is very real. Here is an X-ray of me taken at the Central New York Medical Center. Frontal X-ray. Actually, I think the X-ray is backwards in this photo because you can see my heart on this side. It should be on that side. Sorry about that. So that you can see the blade inside my body. And also, we have a lateral view of that same position. That's the sword inside my body. And if you'd like to see a little sneak peek of what that looks like, here is the sword swallowing from the point of view of the sword. So that's a little sneak preview of that. And of course, the other thing that I'm known for, as I am a rock climbing guide, is rock climbing. And I have peppered this whole presentation with mostly rock climbing photos from here on out of me climbing in different places. I've tried to include a combination of things that are more local and regional, as well as things from around the world. This happens to be just over the lake in the Adirondacks. Beautiful place to climb. And this here is a picture of me in Potrero Chico, Mexico. This was actually just last winter, so not quite a year ago. There's me there in case you didn't see me amongst that landscape. Beautiful, beautiful 2,000-foot limestone cliffs there in Mexico. Now, everything that I do, as I say, I can understand that people think that I must be some sort of adrenaline junkie because these are all thrill-seeking types of behaviors. But I assure you, and we'll get to the nitty-gritty of why this is the case soon, but adrenaline is not something I'm after whatsoever. I'm not an adrenaline junkie. If anything, I guess you could call me a serenity junkie. But there's lots of questions that come up as a result of all the things that I do. With sword swallowing in particular, the question is how? I mean, how does the sword go in? What sort of, and it is kind of interesting, honestly, the anatomy and physiology of it. You have to move certain organs out of the way. You have to get the tilt of the neck just right. You do go into the stomach, and that's not exactly a straightforward thing, if you know what I mean. It's not exactly sword straight anyway. So there are some interesting how questions. And then with the rock climbing, one of my favorite how do you do that questions is, how do you get the rope up there? And I've had people say, do you use a grappling hook? Which is why we put Batman and Robin here. Which is a fair question. If you've never rock climbed before, it is a fair question. How do you get the rope up there? And a grappling hook seems like, I mean, just as good an explanation as any. No, we actually climb and drag the rope behind us is what happens when we do that. But despite all the questions I get, all the how questions, the more important question, which I rarely get, and I think it's a much, much more fascinating question, is this question here. Why? Why do any of this? I've already told you it's not about adrenaline, so why? What's it about? Now, historically, when this question is asked, and it's not asked very often, but when it's asked, the answers, unfortunately, tend to be rather short and not really what one would hope. They're sort of sarcastic, if you will. By way of illustration, in 1924, George Mallory, just before his ill-fated attempt to climb Everest, was asked by the New York Times, I believe it was the New York Times, why do you want to climb Everest? His response? Because it's there. Yes. Those became the most famous, three most famous words in mountaineering, because it's there. And I think it's a terrible, terrible response, because there's so much to this. And it's not just because it's there. At least not for me. And I have to disclaim, I am speaking for myself here. I can't speak for everyone, but I think being around all this for long enough, I can speak for the majority of people who do this and these sorts of things. I think the answer I'm about to give throughout this presentation will encapsulate most of their responses, though there are always people who they're just idiots and want to try stupid things. So I can't speak for everyone. So this question of why, rarely asked, but it's becoming more common now, especially over the past few years. There's been a growing movement of rock climbing and rock climbers. The Access Fund is one of the nation's premier organizations, lobbying in DC all the time to pass legislation to allow us access to public lands for rock climbing. They've brought climbing into the national scene, so it's garnered some attention as a result of that. It says Protect America's Climbing. This is actually another Mexico picture. I apologize for that. Beautiful picture, climbing in Mexico. Locally, there is CRAG Vermont. That's the Climbing Resource Access Group of Vermont. Full disclaimer, I'm on the board of directors of this organization, so when I say they're an amazing organization, it is a little bit biased, but we purchase lands around the state to preserve and conserve and protect for perpetuity and perpetuity. We also work with the state to gain access to the state lands and steward them in a responsible way. And we work with private landowners as well. We've done a lot of stuff to bring climbing to the forefront here in Vermont. And climbing as a whole, last year, I believe it was last year, it could have been 2017, there were 8 million climbers reported climbing in the United States last year. There's been a 12% annual growth in the climbing gym industry, specifically the indoor climbing. And there's over 500 climbing gyms in the country now. That is a huge number, increasing by 12% annually. And of course, the big thing that is bringing climbing to the forefront in people's mind is the fact that it's going to be at the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. So more people are aware of it. More people are starting to ask not just the how, but the why. But in particular, there's one big reason, I think, that people are asking why a whole lot more these days, especially since last year. Because 2 years ago, there was a gentleman, one of the world's best climbers, did this extraordinary feat, which was documented, and a documentary was created out of it by National Geographic, and it hit mainstream theaters toward the world really, but toward the country in mainstream theaters. It was the first major public mainstream documentary about rock climbing to reach us. It featured this guy here, Alex Honnold. Anyone heard of him? Few of you? Yep. So this guy, I love this picture of him because he looks a little bit dorky, and he's really amazing at what he does. So anytime I can make him look a little dorky, I'm like, yes, knock him down a notch because he's so good. I'm teasing. He did what the New York Times calls the greatest athletic feat of any kind ever. What he did was he climbed in Yosemite, El Capitan, a 3,200 foot cliff, which is sort of a benchmark for most climbers. He climbed it with no partner, with no ropes, with no safety equipment whatsoever, himself alone. It's a style of climbing that we call free soloing. When you're climbing with ropes and a partner, we call it free climbing, which is to be distinguished from aid climbing, where you're putting gear into the rock and pulling on it and standing on the gear that you're placing, ladders and ropes and slings and pulleys. When you're just, all the climbing that you generally see in the media is people free climbing. They're just using their hands and their legs, as I say, bringing the rope up with them to use their body to ascend a cliff face. That's what free climbing is. Free soloing is climbing like that alone with no safety gear. This documentary was extraordinary. The feat was exceptional. It really is so exceptional that in sports, it can't even be compared to, say, the 4-minute mile, or now we have the 2-hour marathon, but it can't even be compared to that. It's more like landing on the moon is what it's like. That's how extraordinary an accomplishment it is. And I'll go ahead and show you the trailer for that movie because it's just stunning, and it will probably get your heart racing.
Does it feel different to be up there without a rope? It's obviously like much higher consequence.
People who know a little bit about climbing, they're like, oh, he's totally safe. And then people who really know exactly what he's doing are freaked out.
I've thought about our path for years, and every year I'm like, that's really scary. I'll never be content unless I at least put in the effort. El Cap is the most impressive wall on Earth.
It's 3,200 feet of sheer granite. It's the center of the rock climbing universe.
Obviously, I get interview questions about it all the time. Oh, would you like to do that? You're like, yes, for sure.
So your girlfriend and I are...
It was awesome. Pretty much makes life better in every way.
It's really hard for me to grasp why he wants this. But if he doesn't do this stuff, he'd regret it.
Everybody who's made free soloing a big part of their life is dead now.
I haven't been injured in like 7 years. I suddenly start getting injured all the time.
What if something happens? What if I don't see him again?
I could just walk away, but it's like, I don't want to get me.
I've always been conflicted about shooting a film about free soloing just because it's so dangerous. It's hard to not imagine your friend falling through the frame to his death.
I think when he's free soloing, that's where he feels the most alive, the most everything. How can you even think about taking it away from somebody?
No mistakes tomorrow.
Starting to become fun.
If you're pushing the edge, eventually you find the edge.
I can't believe you guys actually
Hey, Jimmy, you call me. Just start recording.
So if that doesn't make you want to see a film, I don't know what would. It really is quite exceptional. I highly, highly recommend it. What he's doing there with no ropes, I don't condone that. We all have our own level of risk, and that's his acceptable level of risk. I don't endorse that for anyone. It's a very, very personal choice. But nevertheless, that film, which, by the way, won an Oscar award, that's how incredible it is. The first mainstream documentary on the topic, and it won an Oscar. Amazing visuals, amazing story. It has, in the public mind, sort of defined rock climbing, and it has a lot more people asking that question, why? Why do any of that? And even though what we're doing in rock climbing, and all of the things that I've covered that I've done throughout my life, even though that doesn't have the same level of risk as free soloing, the motivation, I believe, is the same. And I want to talk about that motivation. That's why we're here today, to talk about risk in rock climbing and any adventure sport or risky activity and how it relates to well-being. Why do any of it? So that's the question. To help answer that, I'd like to tell you about a particular climb that meant a lot to me. This is a climb that came very early in my climbing career. Still beginning, feeling pretty good and confident, but still progressing through the grades and doing harder and harder things, still finding my footing. I saw online a picture of someone climbing. It was this picture here. And I saw that, and something in my soul just said, I need to do that. I wasn't sure what exactly was calling to me. It's a feature that we call a dihedral, sort of an open book style corner. I really like climbing in those types of features. They feel really cool in the body. You can see his feet are widespread and he's sort of bent over. It's a very three-dimensional sort of climb, and I particularly like that style. But I see a lot of these things, but this picture in particular really called to me. My soul just said, you need to do this. I needed to know where it was. I needed to go there. Here's another picture of it, someone else on the climb. Just to give you an example of how three-dimensional it is, as it requires a lot of different techniques and body positions. So this climb, as it turns out, this is what it is. It's in Joshua Tree, California. It's called Course and Buggy. Grade is 511B, if any of you are interested in climbing grades. Like El Cap at 3,200 feet, this too is pretty big. It comes in at 80 feet. Kind of a different scale, a much different scale. But it's not the height that I'm concerned about here. It was the style, the fact that it called to me. And I scheduled a trip there. I was like, I don't know if I can do this thing. It scares the heck out of me, but there's something about this that I really want to do this climb. I want to experience this movement. Here's a quick picture of me rehearsing it on top rope there. When I got there, I spent a week in Joshua Tree. I spent the entire week climbing other things. I didn't even go to where this climb is and look at it until the very last day, because I knew it represented such a looming thing in my mind that I couldn't face it until I was ready to actually do it. There couldn't be any delay for me to go back and think about it after I saw it. I just had to go and do it. So I spent the entire week there in Joshua Tree. When I finally, climbing around this really alien landscape. Have any of you been to Joshua Tree? It's a weird, it's like another planet. It's amazing, it's beautiful, but it's another planet. I knew there are certain variables that were going to be involved in this climb. It was going to be beyond my perceived ability. I didn't think that I necessarily could climb at that level yet. As I say, this is very early on. I didn't know that I couldn't, but it was harder than anything that I had attempted up until then. I knew also that I would require intense focus in order to do this. I would have to be more focused than I'd ever been in my entire life. As we mentioned, I'd have to use all three dimensions in my body. It really is moving all over the place in some strange, balancy ways. I knew that there were risk of consequences. If I fell, any of the gear that I placed on the way up could, as we say, blow. It could pull out and I could fall further than I anticipated, potentially all the way to the ground. At the very least, I would swing into that corner that you saw and probably bang myself up pretty well. So I knew that there was a risk of consequences. And as I say, it was in a very alien environment. Everything about this was very, very strange. Just being in this place was very weird for me at that time. I've since come to love it, but at the time it was very, very unusual. So I got there to the climb, and I'd love to tell you all the details about my experience of climbing that, but the truth is, I don't actually have much of a memory of climbing it. I can tell you how long it took me, but only because it was being timed. I wasn't doing it for speed, I just wanted to know how long it took. But the actual experience of it, I couldn't tell you, because there was this sort of sense of timelessness about the climb. It took me about 15 minutes to do that climb. That's all, 15 minutes. When I learned that, I thought, really? Because it felt like I was up there for hours. But at the same time, it went by in the blink of an eye. There was just no time whatsoever. Interestingly, despite the challenge of the climb and the fact that it was harder at the time than anything I had ever climbed, there was a sense of effortless grace and automaticity. And what I mean by that is, sure, it was challenging, and I had to be focused and on, but everything just flowed from one thing to the next. My body moved almost as if I wasn't controlling it. It was just doing its thing, and I was just there along for the ride, watching it happen, and there was no sense of thinking about what I need to do next, or pushing hard, or bearing down and gritting my teeth and getting it done. It just all flowed seamlessly, almost magically. There was a sense of complete serenity. I would say blissfully happy, but really there wasn't a psychological state associated with it. I just was being, which was extraordinary. There's this merging of the self and the environment. I felt like I really was part of the rock. Like there was no division between us whatsoever. Everything just made sense. My self-consciousness completely disappeared. I stopped wondering, am I good enough? Can I do this? How do I look on this? Do I look cool? Is everyone amazed at what I'm doing? All of those questions just fell away. I didn't care because there was no I to actually care. And finally, there were no distractions whatsoever. It was pinpoint laser focus. Now, in describing this, some of you may recognize that state. Maybe you've experienced it yourself. I know we're here in Vermont. Maybe we have a lot of outdoor people who do outdoor activities. Maybe even just whether it's skiing or hiking or whatever it is you like to do. Yeah, John? Runners get into the zone. And that's exactly my point. That's exactly what I wanted to point out. We have a name for this. We call it in the zone. Musicians have a name for this as well. They call it in the pocket. And even writers have a name for it. They just call it simply the muse. So this is a known state. In fact, Abraham Maslow, the great psychologist, gave it a very specific name. He called it peak experience. And peak experience, this is how he describes peak experience. The rare, exciting, oceanic, deeply moving, exhilarating, elevating experiences that generate an advanced form of perceiving reality and are even mystic and magical in their effect upon the experimenter. Those are pretty bold words, pretty extraordinary state to be in. In fact, it's such an extraordinary state to be in that Maslow even says that peak experience should be considered one of the most important goals of life, as it's an indication of self-actualization. That's pretty big. So important is peak experience to him that he actually positioned it at the very top of what's become known as his hierarchy of needs. Right there, self-actualization. Above physiological needs, safety needs, all of that is self-actualization. Pretty big. Pretty important. Today, we have another name for it. We sometimes refer to it as peak experience, but there's been so much work done in psychology and neurobiology to define this state and figure out what it is that it actually has a new name. It was actually named this in the 70s by a Hungarian psychiatrist or psychologist called, his name is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. You'll see it spelled out later. Looks nothing like it sounds. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He called it flow. Because everything flows effortlessly from one place to the next. You feel like you're in a flow. In fact, flow is not primarily characterized by subjective feelings. As I said, I can't even describe the emotional state. It wasn't anything because the essence of flow is not a subjective feeling. It's characterized by the removal of the interference of the thinking mind. The thinking mind, the self, goes away. That's the state that we're talking about. In fact, he says, Csikszentmihalyi says that flow, this being in the zone, is autotelic. It's an end in itself. It's worth pursuing for its own sake. That's how important it is. Regardless of what mechanism you use to get there, it's worth pursuing for its own sake. In fact, You'll see that this is my wife here, there's a big smile on her face because Csikszentmihalyi says that flow is the secret to happiness. So that is why we climb. Now we're going to go a little further because not only is it the secret to happiness, not only do you get all those positive benefits of the loss of the self-consciousness, the focus, the exhilaration of merging of self and environment, the complete dropping away of the self. Not only do you get that, but there's actually other benefits to being in this flow state. There's side effects, I'm calling them. The first is for productivity. There's been lots of studies of this flow state, and there are many, many ways you can get into this flow state. And it's been discovered by a McKinsey & Company 10-year study showed that executives in flow are 500% more productive than their counterparts. In terms of creativity, the University of Sydney study revealed an 8 times increase in creativity as a result of being in flow. And in terms of learning, this is pretty amazing. People in flow, the time to learn new information, tasks, or skills can be cut in half. And in some cases, some studies have shown that being in flow can increase your learning speed by 10 times. That is massive. I've put here, and this isn't my own little example, but imagine learning a new language in 6 weeks instead of 6 months. That's how powerful flow is. But here's the thing about flow. Flow doesn't happen by accident. Well, I should clarify that. Flow doesn't happen randomly. We'll call it that. Flow doesn't happen randomly. It can happen by accident when all the variables line up. But there's a way of actually creating this flow state. There's a way of understanding what's happening to create this, that we can then set up the variables, set up the environment so as to allow this state to arise naturally. They're often called flow triggers. They're broadly broken up into 4 different categories: psychological, environmental, social, and creative. And when it comes to rock climbing in particular, rock climbing is, and all extreme sports are actually extremely good at inducing this flow state. They naturally induce it. Because look at the things that need to line up in order to create this flow. Any combination of these things can create a flow state. But how many of these boxes does rock climbing tick? Start with psychological. Is there intensely focused attention? Better believe it. Are there clear goals? Absolutely. Is there immediate feedback? Well, yeah. Quite the immediate feedback. And you need to have the proper challenge to skill ratio. So, what about the environmental? Are there high consequences? You saw that trailer. There's absolutely high consequences. Rich environment. Remember that alien environment that I described in Joshua Tree? Even not being in Joshua Tree, just being here on the cliffs around here. When you're up on the side of a cliff, that environment is so rich. You really get this sense of awe at how small you are as a human being compared to the environment. It really puts things in perspective. That's a very, very rich environment. And then that deep embodiment, the movement of rock climbing and lots of other extreme sports demand that you have an embodied consciousness, that you move in 3 dimensions and sense yourself and your position in space using your proprioception in relation to gravity. It demands deep embodiment. Now, as it turns out, the social and creative, rock climbing also ticks that as well. We won't go into point by point, but all of the things that with the exception of Alex Honnold, we climb with partners, and it's a partnership that makes it happen. So it absolutely ticks all those boxes as well, and it ticks the creative boxes too. So rock climbing in particular is perfectly positioned to pull all of these triggers. So any high-risk, high-consequence activity can do that. Just take a peek at my slides here. Yeah, I'm going to go maybe off on a tangent just a little bit. So what you need for flow to occur is focus. And high risk drives focus. So risk drives focus, and flow follows focus. So that's why high-risk, high-consequence things can lead to flow so quickly and so easily. But there has to be that challenge to skill ratio. It needs to be perfectly pitched just outside of your comfort zone, which is one of the reasons I teach the skills to help people reach the edge of their comfort zone, because you need to reach just beyond it in order to create the sensation of flow. It doesn't mean that you're not capable of doing it. It just means you think you're not capable of doing something. We always have more to give. For instance, this is one little demonstration, kind of silly, that I love sharing with people. Here's what I want you to do. I want all of you to take your right hand and raise it as high as you can. Go ahead and do that now. Excellent. Now raise it 1 inch higher. There you go. I asked you to raise your hand as high as you could, and then you raised it higher. So we hold ourselves back, and that's the point. My goal as a trainer is to get people to reach that 1 inch higher. So that's that. Flow is not just for athletes, though. It is for everyone. I put, literally, these are just random things I thought of last night while sitting on my couch. I was like, who can get in the flow? And so I just plopped all these things on there because every single one of these is true. All of these people can get into flow. We can all get into flow. It's just a question of knowing what triggers you can pull. Take, for instance, like writers. Writers are famous for getting in flow. They get into this groove, and they just write and write and write, and before they know it, the day is completely passed, and they've written so much stuff. Now, the opposite is also true. Sometimes they, like myself, bang their head against the wall all day long and come up with nothing. That's the opposite of flow. Nevertheless, writers get it all the time. One of the things that, the key thing is risk. Risk doesn't just mean physical risk. Writing is an act of risk. You're risking putting yourself out there because you write for an audience, don't you? Someone is going to read this, whether you're publishing a book or publishing a blog online or publishing something in a newspaper, someone's going to read this. You're putting yourself at risk of judgment. You're putting yourself at social risk. Perhaps you might fear you'll be ostracized based upon what you write. You'll be criticized. That's a deeply ingrained human fear, being ostracized from their community. And it's a risk that all writers take. And every single one of these people, especially creative people, take these risks all the time. So there's many ways to create risk. Wall Street traders are very well known for their risk-taking activities, but that's not physical, that's financial. They're also very well known for getting into the flow state. They're high performers, they're peak performers because of this high risk, high consequence. So there's many ways to create this. So it comes down to this. Why do I climb? I climb because I like what it demands of me. More specifically, I climb because I like who I become. I'll leave you with this here, this wonderful quote from René Damal. You cannot stay on the summit forever. You have to come down again. So why bother in the first place? Just this. What is above knows what is below, but what is below does not know what is above. One climbs, one sees. One descends, one no longer sees, but one has seen. There is an art of conducting oneself in the lower regions by the memory of what one saw higher up. When one can no longer see, one can at least still know. We become better people by reaching this flow state, by connecting with our values, by experiencing what it means to be a fully alive, rich human being. And that's why I climb. It's not because it's adrenaline-inducing. It's not because it's thrill-seeking. The only reason in that regard that I climb is because climbing in particular, along with the sword swallowing and the fire and all those other things, it pulls that risk trigger. And it's not about the risk, it's about the flow. So that's why. I'll leave you with this. If you guys are interested in further reading about this, over the past few years there's been some amazing work done and a couple amazing books that have come out, both featuring Stephen Kotler as the author, Jamie Wheel, the co-author on the second book. The Rise of Superman is very specifically about extreme sports and the neurobiology of the flow state. I highly recommend it. If you're interested in seeing how these states are beginning to change society, then I would direct you towards Stealing Fire. Again, same theme. You'll get Similar information out of both, just slightly different approaches. Highly recommend them both. And if you want to see lots of cool climbing photos, if any of you are on Instagram, feel free to follow me. I'm at Remarkably Human. You can also just type in my name, Roderick Russell. I'm the only sword-swallowing rock climber on there. So you can find me there and follow me there. And that is the bulk of the presentation. There we go. Why don't I put that back up there for you? But I'll take some questions in a few minutes. We have time for that. If you guys are interested, and I don't want to force anything on any of you, but if you're interested, I do happen to have a couple swords here with me. So by applause, how many of you would be interested in seeing a demonstration of sword swallowing? Okay. All right. And just by curiosity, by applause, how many of you are on the fence? One. Excellent. Good. Two. So, well, I'll tell you this. I've had lots of people watch this demonstration in the reflection of someone else's sunglasses. So I'm not going to take offense if you decide to do something like that or if you decide to close your eyes. But it seems that we have enough of a majority that's interested in this that I'm going to go ahead and do this for you. Now, I should just say, since we have the time, in fact, why don't I'll hop right up here. We have a camera back here filming this for later purposes. I'll ask you, what would be best for the camera if I were on the stage and there were slide behind? Well, I guess, no, we'd have to turn off the projector, wouldn't we? I'm guessing it would be better for you if I were on the stage. Can we turn off the projector real quick? Okay, we'll turn off the projector. Thank you, John. Now let me talk for just a minute about, bye, thank you for coming. Thank you. I understand. Now, speaking of flow, there's the risk, obviously, involved with sword swallowing. There's also the question of the skill to challenge ratio. I've been swallowing swords for 20 years. The challenge, despite the fact that it's an extreme stunt, the challenge is not really all that massive for me anymore. It's very, very uncomfortable. And it does sometimes, like today, it does sometimes go down a little rough, especially when they're cold. They've been sitting in my car for a while, so they're a little bit cold. Tends to, when it touches the throat goes and sucks up a little bit. So it might go down a little bit rough. But overall, the act of swallowing a sword, as challenging as it is fairly comfortable for me now. So when things get too comfortable, too within your comfort zone, they stop producing flow, because that flow state depends on a delicate balance of skill to challenge and by existing right in that arousal state just prior to high anxiety, but greater than your comfort zone state. So you need to be slightly stressed in order to produce flow. You can't do it without stress. So does sword swallowing, this is the question, does sword swallowing still produce flow in me? Because at one time it absolutely did. When I was first learning this, you can be absolutely certain it produced flow. I was very focused. Now, it actually does not. As strange as it sounds, it's just another thing that I do. So I don't go out and in my personal life, I don't recreationally swallow swords to get the flow experience. It just doesn't exist for me. But I do swallow swords as a demonstration of what's possible if you're willing to push outside your comfort zone and continue developing your skill and work with the mental skills required to push outside your comfort zone. So that's what we're going to do today. Let me hop right up here. Wow, didn't expect that to move. That might be the most dangerous part of today's demonstration. So I'd like to start with a 13-inch solid steel blade. Okay, tough crowd. How about we double the length? Is that better? Okay. All right, we'll go twice as big. All right. I'm not going to beat around the bush here. I will get straight to the point. Thank you. All right. I know some of you are wondering if it was real, so there you go. All right. You guys are actually going to let me do this, huh? The video wasn't enough? Okay, I'll tell you what. I do have to remove some of my clothing for this to happen. Don't worry, just my jacket, John. Not that kind of crowd. All right, here we go. Now, you guys better clap for this, okay? Now, I know we're a small audience, and I know this has been like a lecture-style presentation, so it's not exactly the applause sort of thing, but if this blade goes down, I really do want you guys to applaud. I want you to clap. I want you to scream. I want you to yell and cheer at the top of your lungs, because this is kind of flipping crazy. So, all right. Now, there's obviously going to be some unusual sights. I'm swallowing a sword. There might also be some unusual sounds. So I'm going to go ahead and flip the microphone off. I mean, unless you guys want the microphone on. No, I didn't think so. All right, is it off there? Did it go off? Yes, it's off. Okay. Nope, I got it. It's off, John. John? That's why he can't hear me, because it's off. All right. Of course, the camera still has the microphone on, so she's going to get a nice, wonderful audio on this. All right, here we go. You guys remember our deal, right? This blade goes down, you go absolutely crazy. Here we go. Oh, kind of disgusting, but well, folks, from the bottom of my sword-swallowing stomach, it has been an absolute pleasure giving this talk to you today and showing you a little demonstration of sword swallowing. I'm going to stick around for some questions, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming out. All right, let's do some questions. I'm going to flip the microphone back on here, and he'll flip it on over here. Yes, back there, you raised your hand?
So, have you ever been thrust into a situation that got you into flow that you didn't expect?
Have I ever been thrust into a situation that brought me into flow that I didn't expect to be in? Yes, quite often. And I have to say, climbing in particular, I hate to keep going back to climbing, but climbing in particular is very good at that. Especially the kind of climbing that I tend to do. There's different types of climbing. When you're lead climbing, that is when you're climbing up a cliff from the bottom to the top and you're bringing the rope with you, what you're doing is you're clipping into protection along the way so that should you fall, there's something somewhere that will hopefully catch you. And you tend to climb above this protection. So if you fall, you'll actually fall back to, so if I place a piece of protection and I climb 10 feet up and I'm 10 feet above that protection, if I fall, I'm falling back down that 10 feet plus another 10 feet because the rope's out 10 feet. So I'll fall 20 feet plus the stretch of the rope, which tends to be about 30%. So that's how lead climbing works. When you're doing what's called sport climbing, this tends to be on cliffs that people have drilled into the cliff and placed what we call bolts. And they're usually fairly well spaced together, and the fall potential is very small. The falls aren't usually that huge. And it's a well-defined route, and you can see exactly where you need to go by following the bolt line. You don't need to do any figuring out of where it goes. But the kind of climbing I like to do is called trad climbing or traditional climbing, where there are no bolts. All you have is a blank cliff and gear that you place on your harness. And as you climb, you find little cracks and nooks and crannies to wedge things into. So we have what are called stoppers. They're just little pieces of metal with a loop of wire on it, and you wedge that into a crack, and then you clip that, and that's your protection. If you fall, that kind of jams itself into the crack even more and catches you, hopefully. And so we have other pieces of gear that we put in to do this with. But the point is unlike sport climbing, with trad climbing, you have to find the route. The route doesn't exist. It's not the same passage that everyone climbs because that's where the bolts are. You have to figure out where you can place protection, and you can be on a cliff that's 300 feet wide and 600 feet tall, and you're at the bottom, and you have to figure out where in the sea of rock you have to climb. And that kind of climbing in particular is very, very good at unexpectedly inducing flow. Because you can be out, you're thinking, we have guidebooks that say, oh yeah, follow this feature, then kind of go that way, and then head up that way. But you're out there, one, the descriptions aren't always that great. And then you're up there 200 feet in the air, and you start wandering into this place, this area of the rock, and you're like, wait a minute, am I in the right spot? Am I going to be able to find protection? I don't know, my last protection is 20 feet down that way, and I don't see anything for another 20 feet. Do I really want to go this way? And so you have to make those decisions. Am I going to push forward, or am I going to down climb and try to find another way? And so that nature of the unexpected in trad climbing, the improvisational nature of it, really is phenomenal for inducing flow. And it's one of the reasons why it's one of my favorite kinds of climbing. So yes, another. Sudden change in weather. Yes, a very sudden change in weather. Yes, that too can induce flow. Sometimes, dramatic enough weather changes kind of push you too far into the anxiety because you're just scrambling to get out of there. But that too can happen. I had an experience once where I was out on a climb that was 7 pitches, essentially 7 rope lengths, and we're 1,000 feet up in the air. It's supposed to be a bluebird day in this big notch, and we got to the top of this 1,000-foot climb, and we turn around, and there are these big black clouds rolling over the ridge on the other side. And we're like, well, that wasn't forecast. And seconds later, it started downpouring. We had to rappel out of there. I was yelling up to my other climbers saying, if you see lightning, let me know because we're changing our plan. And we were trying as fast as we could to descend this 1,000-foot cliff. And eventually night fell. We were in the rain, in the night, rappelling down a cliff. Thankfully, we brought our headlamps. We had a whole bunch of other things go wrong. And this is quite far away from civilization as well, no cell phone reception. And there were moments on there where I wouldn't say I was terrified, but I was leaning more towards the panic end of the spectrum. And there were times when I was really in that flow state where I was like, okay, we've got this, but just barely. And so yeah, the weather absolutely can do that. Do you say denial? Yes. Is denial of a situation a problem? Absolutely. And in fact, as a mental fitness coach and trainer, what I teach is specifically, it's interesting that you say, is denial a problem? Because the therapeutic training protocol that I teach is called acceptance and commitment therapy. And so it's the polar opposite of denial. Most people, when they start being stressed, have avoidance behaviors. And they go in the opposite direction and pretend that it doesn't exist and try to hold down the thoughts so that they don't bother them, just deny that they exist. And I teach the exact opposite. I teach a complete open-armed welcoming of the feelings and the sensations and the situation, to be fully present and aware with it, and to work with it from a witnessing perspective rather than a controlling perspective where you're trying to hold it down and force it to not even exist. So denial is a problem, and it can actually create a dangerous situation. Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking about the photographer, flying also with Alex Honnold.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you care to say about the focus that he needed to have.
Oh, yeah. And what was the focus that the photographer climbing with Honnold needed to have? Intense, and there was also, going to the denial thing, Jimmy Chin, the primary photographer and director of this film, you heard him say in the trailer that he has mixed feelings about filming this kind of thing, because at any moment you could see your friend falling to his death through the frame. And so what he has to have is a profound acceptance of the consequences. So again, speaking to that denial thing, he can't pretend, oh, this is going to be great, he's going to have it. He has to be prepared for that eventuality. And if you see the film, and I absolutely recommend that everyone sees the film, you'll see that a lot of the photographers on the ground are, at certain times, they're watching this whole thing, zoomed in with their cameras. They'll turn around and they're like, I can't watch this section because I know this is a challenging one. And I can't deny that it's challenging, but it doesn't mean I have to watch either. What role does focus play? Quite a bit. You have to have a focus on your values specifically. The value of you're powerless to help this man should something go wrong. So you have to be really highly in alignment and focused on your values, and the value is supporting him in any way you can and capturing the documentation for posterity. There are certain situations, the one in particular, which again, if you see the film, you'll see, that Honnold didn't want anyone filming the section because he didn't want a human being around, and none of the human beings wanted to film this section. So what they did was they set up cameras that could be triggered remotely so that nobody had to watch it. And he climbed through this section. There was no human to watch him and nobody having to watch for that very reason. So, question back there?
Could you talk about the importance of visualization in preparation for
Yeah. Yeah, this is what is the importance of visualization? This is a very, very hot button topic because you see a lot of people in sports psychology talking about visualization, and you see Honnold talking about visualization in the movie, and a lot of the climbing films lately, so the top performers are talking about and even showing, you'll see them visualizing a route. They'll be standing on the ground and they'll be going like this as they visualize things. Here's the challenge though. Visualization is one of 4 what we call standard traditional psychological skills training. And as it turns out, the past 30 years of research have shown that visualization alone, and in fact any one of these 4 traditional psychological skills that tend to be used by coaches to increase performance, used alone, the studies have shown they have 0 effect. So visualization by itself doesn't have any effect whatsoever. That doesn't mean that it's not important. It does mean that it needs to be used in combination with things. By way of illustration, I just recently wrote an article for my private email list about the power of breathing and a very specific breathing technique. Breathing is part of one of these traditional skills called arousal control. And arousal control is taught by coaches all the time. But arousal control itself won't do anything. Breathing itself won't do anything. But if you combine it with the mental techniques that I teach, the evidence-based mental techniques, what it does is it can de-escalate physiologically a situation so that you can gain the distance from your physiological response so as to be able to apply the mental training. But if you're just using breathing itself, it's not going to do anything. You need to have other techniques to step in when the breathing accomplishes its goal. And it's the same with visualization. By itself, no particular effect. In fact, there's a danger with visualization. A lot of people, well, the danger is this. A lot of people don't know how to visualize. When you say visualize doing something, what they do is they visualize their success of doing something. But when you visualize your success, what you do is you prevent the mind and the body from being prepared to carry out the journey to that success. It's already received the reward for having succeeded mentally by visualizing that success. So if you're visualizing success, you're going to jeopardize your possibility of performing well.
It's more important to visualize the process.
Yes.
Not the end result.
Exactly. You need to visualize the process as if you're rehearsing it. So you can rehearse and practice in your visualization, but you can't just visualize your success. That will shoot you in the foot. So very good question. Yes?
Back to the sword skull.
Yes.
Have you ever been doing a demonstration where you're not physically able to do that?
Have I ever been doing a demonstration where I'm not physically able to swallow the sword? Yes and no. Every time I've been on stage, and I've done this thousands and thousands of times on stage, every single time I've been able to swallow the sword. But on a handful of occasions, it wasn't on my first attempt. There have been several occasions where I have started down my throat and realized something's not right here. And I've had to back up, Sometimes I have to remove it and just start over, regather myself. Other times I just back up a few inches and then adjust the sword and go back down. And there have been times, you know, as a performer on stage, there's a pretty high pressure to actually do the thing you're billed to be doing. So there have been a few times where I've made the unwise decision to, despite the fact that it didn't feel right, I push. Thankfully, nothing has come of it on stage. I have been injured once, but it wasn't on stage, it was during practice. But on stage, no injuries. I've had some odd things happen on stage, which we won't go into, but I've never been injured on stage, thankfully. But yes, I have had to back up and redo things. And I should say that even though I talked about sword swallowing and how it's a comfortable thing for me now, every time I place that blade above my head, there's pretty intense fear. And my mind spins up stories every single time. Even though I've been doing it for 2 decades, my mind says, oh my God, is this going to be the time that you hurt yourself? Or are you feeling okay today? Or is this too close to breakfast? It spins up all these stories, and I just have to practice my own, practice what I preach, essentially, the own skills and mental techniques to accept and then do what we call diffuse from the thoughts. Because it's when we start believing that the thoughts are real and that they represent reality that we start running into trouble, because we will then act based upon the thoughts. And the thoughts don't necessarily represent reality. So I have to ask myself, is this thought helpful or is it not helpful? Because I fact check it, I ask myself, is what it's saying true or not? This is particularly important in climbing, where I'm looking at a potential fall, and my mind's saying, oh my God, you're going to fall, you're going to hit the side of that rock, the rope is going to break, you're going to fall to your death, or worse, you're going to fall and become paralyzed, and then everyone's going to leave you, you're going to be unloved, and you're going to live the rest of your life in a bed. I kid you not, these things happen in an instant when you're climbing. So I have to fact check them. I have to say, okay, that's a pretty wild story. What's the reality of this story? And I do a quick assessment, and then I decide, okay, I might possibly sprain or break my ankle if I hit that wall hard enough, but is that in alignment with my value right now? And if it's in alignment with my value and I'm okay with that consequence, then I say, okay, it's fact-checked. I need to ask, is the thought helpful now? And in the case of that catastrophic story, no, it's not helpful. So I have to let it go. And what I do is I refocus, become task-oriented on the climb, and just I thank my mind. I'm like, hey, thanks for bringing up that story. I appreciate it, but I'm kind of busy right now. And I go back to doing what I'm doing. So I think I may have wandered a little off on a tangent there, but hopefully it was interesting nevertheless. Yeah.
In eating fire,
Yes.
have you ever caught your beard?
Have I ever caught my beard on fire? Full disclosure, the beard is about a year and a half old, so I haven't had it for that long. So it's a very new thing for me. I'm still discovering whether or not I'm going to catch it on fire. So I've done plenty of fire eating indoors with the beard. I've had no problems whatsoever. I have, before a couple performances, I have trimmed my mustache just a little bit, just take no chances. Outdoors, however, I have attempted it a few times, and even with the slightest breeze, it just blows it slightly over or up, and it's not, it doesn't catch fire, but it does, singe the hairs, and they curl up real quick. And I know this before I had a beard. There have been times when I've been outdoors eating fire, and the wind will gently blow it up towards my nose, and my nose hairs singe. And have you ever smelled burning hair? Yeah, it's terrible. And so all my nose hair just rolls up into these little burnt, singed balls, and that smell does not go away for days. So that's been my experience with hair and fire. I'm reluctant to eat fire outdoors now because of the new beard. Indoors, however, as long as there's no weird air conditioning blowing things around, it tends to be okay. Yeah. 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 That's a really good question. Will Alex Honnold quit while he's ahead? If you ask his girlfriend, the answer is yes, if she has anything to say about it. I suspect, while he may not do anything that big again, I don't think he's done soloing, climbing alone with no ropes. I think it's probably part of his experience. To put it in perspective, not long after this, He and Tommy Caldwell, another very famous climber, the two of them set the speed record for climbing the nose of El Cap, which started when Warren Harding first, not the President Warren Harding, but a climber, Warren Harding, did it decades ago. I believe it was 40 or 42 days it took him to climb El Cap. It was then bested, and it like got down to, I don't know the actual times, it got down to like a week, and then it got down to a couple days, and then finally someone did this climb in one day, 24 hours. They climbed 3,200 feet from the base to the top, which once took 40 plus days. But then, once someone had done it in one day, it started dropping 6 hours, 5 hours, 4 hours. And just after that movie, or not long thereafter, the two of them, Tommy Caldwell and Alex Honnold, set the speed record, which ended up being 1 hour, I believe in 57 or 58 minutes, just under 2 hours anyway, is what they set the speed record. So just under 2 hours to do that massive climb, which took months before. And so if that gives you any idea, yeah, he's still up to his antics. Yeah, and climbing that fast with that speed, you take a lot of risks. Yeah. Yeah. Yes? Third row, rather. Yeah.
Do any climbers lose their confidence in the middle of a climb?
Do any climbers lose their confidence in the middle of a climb? Heck yes, absolutely. I've been one of them. And thankfully, I have the training to fall back on to sort of regain that confidence. But absolutely, people lose their confidence. The challenge comes when you're in the middle of a climb, and if you have to bail on a climb, as we call it, it's not always that big of a deal. If you can get some protection into the wall, you can lower from that protection and just call it a day. You can either leave your gear there and let someone else come and have it, or you can retrieve your gear somehow, hiking to the top or doing another climb and getting it, or having a friend get it for you. So it's not that big of a deal to bail in the middle of a climb. But the challenge comes when you're on a climb and you're way above your gear with a bad fall potential that could be catastrophic, and you can't find any more gear to put in. You then have to ask yourself, do I take the fall and risk injuring myself? Do I down climb, which is challenging? It's one thing to go up a cliff, it's something else entirely to down climb. So we actually train that. We do train how to climb down as well as up so that we can get ourselves out of situations like that. But yeah, it's a pretty common thing for people to lose confidence or lose ability. You climb so hard after a while, your muscles just can't do anything more, and you can't hold on to anything, no matter how big it is. So the body can just give out at a certain point too. So it is a pretty common thing. There's just multiple ways of dealing with it. And second row.
When you're speed climbing, are you allowed to use someone else's pins?
When you're speed climbing, are you allowed to use someone else's pins? That's a very good question. When you're speed climbing on a big wall like El Cap, the ethic is any way that you can get to the top is fair game. So if there's gear that's fixed in the wall, like decades ago, people would aid climb these things and they'd pound in pitons into the cliff. Those pitons are still there. They're not always the safest things because they do rust after a while, but sometimes they're in there really good. Sometimes modern day climbers will come along and they'll put a piece of gear in the wall and they can't get it back out because it's wedged in there so hard. So that becomes a fixed piece of gear. There are also, in some places on El Cap, there are bolts in the wall. People have drilled bolts to help aid climbers. To help aid the climbers, not to help aid climbers. And so the ethic is, yes, and you can pull on anything. When you're speed climbing, you're not necessarily free climbing the rock with your hands and feet. Sometimes you'll clip a bolt and just pull. Not even on the rock. You'll pull on, we call them quick draws or alpine draws. It's the thing that you clip the rope into. It becomes a great handhold when you clip it into a bolt. So you can pull on that. If there's another pin or piton there, absolutely, you can pull on that too. So that is the ethic with speed climbing. Any way you can get to the top. Yep.
And do you think when they were climbing El Cap, that the first person it took 42 days to climb?
Something like 40 or 42, yeah.
And now they've cut it down?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the people that recently climbed it had an advantage because there was pins left in there, so they didn't have to drive the pin, they just clip it and pull?
Yep.
So
Yeah, in case you guys didn't hear that, is it a fair comparison, modern climbers using gear that's already on the wall compared to the people who are putting up the first time? Is it a fair comparison, the speed? No, absolutely not. It's not a fair comparison. To be clear, the people doing it at first weren't necessarily doing it for speed. They were doing it to see if it could be done. By way of illustration, more recently, the other half of that speed climbing duo that I just mentioned, Tommy Caldwell, he recently put up the most difficult climb in the world, also in Yosemite. It's called the Dawn Wall. And it took him 7 years to put that thing up. And on the final push, when they actually did it, it took them, I believe, 21 days, 20-something days, 21 I think is what it was. It took them that long to do it. One person has repeated it, and he did it way faster. But here's the thing. He already knew where the route went because people had done it before. He saw all the footage, he saw all the pictures. There were already some bolts in places, and they were there because the people who pioneered the route put it up. And this is just a few years ago that this happened. So this is a modern example of the very question that you're bringing up. Is the person that repeated the route of the same caliber as the people who first put up the route? And I would argue that no, the person who pioneered the route, the first ascensionist, they're the ones that had the vision, they're the ones that had the tenacity and the perseverance to figure it all out and put it together into one coherent thing. And everyone that comes after, they might be doing hard climbing in terms of technical moves, but they're not doing hard climbing in terms of figuring it all out because it's already done. So no, it's not a fair comparison. Is there someone at the top throwing sandwiches down? Very good question. In most cases, no. In the case of the speed climbing, it happens so fast they don't need to. But you, like normal people now, you and I, if we went to Yosemite, we could spend 4 days on that wall. What do? What we do is we haul it all up with us. So we create this big, we call it a haul bag. We fill it with everything we need, the food, the water, everything. And as that stays, say at the bottom, but we attach a rope to it. And we drag that rope, all the slack, up as far as the rope will go. We find what's called a belay. We set up a belay, a stance where we can bring our partner up. And then we literally set up a pulley and haul up that bag of gear. And then we anchor it to the wall. And then we climb the next pitch. And we leave it there. And when we get to the top of the next pitch, the next couple 100 feet up, we haul up that bag. So there's a lot of hauling of heavyweight bags up this cliff for days. Mm-hmm.
There's an overhang. Mm-hmm. I've seen pictures of people climbing across the overhang.
Sure.
How on earth do they do that?
How do people climb overhangs? Very carefully is the answer. No, it's just climbing. It just takes a lot of strength and skill. So as the wall leans back, you need to find hands that you can pinch or slot your fingers in or push apart, any combination of things, and then find places for your feet where you can then put pressure on your feet and your hands and transfer that pressure from your hands through a stable core, a solid body, right into your feet so you stay upside down on that wall, and then you move at it. Yeah, yeah. It's quite the feat. Yeah. Any other questions? Have I been injured? Climbing specifically? Yes and no. There's a lot of overuse injuries, actually. This past season, I tore a ligament in my hand, and that was kind of due to an overuse thing. It just wore down and eventually tore. I've had other types of overuse injuries in my hands, but I've never had any major thing where I broke a leg or anything like that. So I've certainly been sore, but thankfully no major injuries. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, guys.